Hello, very beautiful community. The tyrant in the Kremlin is meeting Gerasimov at a place the Kremlin calls a joint command support post. Nobody knows where that is. And he's talking about the acquisition of extra street corners and blocks and half blocks and villages, in particular announcing the alleged acquisition of Konstantinovka, in response to which Mr. Zelensky has said that if you've captured it, why don't you meet me there? Now, the reason Putin is there is partly this. This is the regime's own data showing a decline in support for Putin, including some unprecedented drops over the course of a single week. Now, we've got to gather a few pinches of salt here and throw them on this graph. So let's do that first. Number one, this graph completely obliterates the distinction between people who substantively support Putin and his actions, which are a minority, and people who just outsource politics to Putin. And their position isn't to be pro-war or against the war. Their position is to hope that whatever Putin does, he's got good reasons for it, even though they can't know what they are. The second problem with this graph is that it partly just disappears people who are less loyal to the regime and overrepresents people who are loyal to the regime. And so this is a decline in support for Putin among people who are more loyal to Putin. The third thing to say about this graph is that we have got to leave more detailed analysis of it to particular experts. And what we can do is simply point out that it's the trends that matter. So we're not looking at the numbers, we're looking at directionality. And what we've got here is an unprecedented 3.5% drop in trust in Putin over the course of a week, and a significant drop in approval for Putin's actions, down to 66.9%. These North Korean numbers are silly, they don't matter, but the directionality does matter, especially as this is data generated by the regime. Now, this is not data generated by the regime. This is Levada. That's a designated foreign agent. But as Greg Uden would say, Levada is still part of the, inadvertently perhaps, part of the regime's mechanism of self-legitimation. The regime loves the generation of these bogus 70% figures, and it uses them to tell potential opponents, the people are with us, to tell the people are with us, and to tell members of the regime, don't turn on Putin because the people are with him. And here we've got a 5% drop in approval for Putin's actions in 2026. And the longer run story, and this is not current, this stops in 2026, is an elevation of support 2014 till the end of the 2010s, and then another bump in 2022 with a significant downward direction in 2026. So what have we got there? We've got in orange the notion that things are moving in the right direction, that's going down. We've got in blue support for Putin going down, and we've got in green the notion that things are not moving in the right direction, going up. So Putin's got a problem with the kind of media event he's doing there. He's declaring he's captured another street corner, but the problem is that the kind of depoliticization among his population on which he depends to be allowed to go on with the prosecution of the war means that his population are completely uninterested in these updates. The only bit of the population that's eagerly interested in them are people in the minority, far below 20%, who substantively support the war, but they're largely interested in this negatively. To them, this sounds like bad news. Well, you've captured another street corner, lost the street corner somewhere else. And for the majority of the population, this is irrelevant. I mean, imagine being in an abusive and disbalanced relationship with a spouse who has too much power, has control over the finances, and for reasons you can't understand, that spouse starts a dispute with the neighbors and tries to take control over the neighbor's driveway, starts putting cones there in the middle of the night and says, well, honey, you know, I advanced my cones on the neighbor's driveway by 3 inches in the middle of the night. You think, oh God, whatever, I'm not even going to get into this. You know, whatever he's doing there with these cones, let him get on with it. So it's not very, very thrilling. And that's not a problem Putin can solve, because he depends on a particular balance between depoliticization and politicization, heavily leaning toward the majority of the population, simply not taking substantive positions on what he's doing, which means the acquisition or the false advertisement of acquisition of tiny villages doesn't do anything for them. Moreover, Putin is increasingly being faced with evidence of things not going well. And what does he have to say in response? What he says in response is essentially a kind of reversion into technocratic language. You might think of it as the language of centrist technocracies in the West times by 20, where the answer to every problem is the system we have in place are correct, but they just need to be ironed out to make sure they work properly. But in fact, what this is more like is a kind of late Soviet explanation of what the problems are. That's to say, the systems are all good, but there are a few knots and obstacles, and we've got to fix them, we've got to iron them out, and then things will work well. Now, that's a dangerous analogy to make, because in so many ways, this regime is radically discontinuous with the Soviet regime. This is a hard right regime. It's not a hard left regime. So it's very, very different. And even in Putin's particular case, his KGB background is psychologically less interesting as an explanation of what he is about than his childhood trauma and his years in criminal Petersburg. But nevertheless, that's roughly what he's doing. And it's not very persuasive, but it's a reflection of the fact that he doesn't really have answers for now. Is he panicking because of this? No, I'd say he is hunkering down and waiting for circumstances to change 6 months from now. And one of the thoughts he has is, well, we might have a pop at wintertime at Ukraine's energy system again. Maybe we'll generate an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, and that could tilt things in our direction. So Putin is simply waiting it out. And that's the second part of the answers he gives when it's implied that there are problems. The first part is his bureaucratic evasiveness. The second part is, yes, we're behind on a few dimensions, but it's simply a matter of time before we get where we need to go. Well, we've got to have more satellites in the sky for our communication. That'll happen eventually. Or we've got to catch up on the drone warfare. Well, we're about 6 months away from that. That's a second kind of answer Putin gives. We've got it right, but it's just a matter of time until we build up sort of production we need, for instance. Final remark for us is that given what we've said, we are to expect recalcitrance and escalation from Putin rather than compromise. And that means we're going to see the extension of the war onto the soils of both countries. And that includes the extension of the war on Russian soil. We always talk about this, but again, despite this lid flying about on the edges of Moscow a few days ago, we haven't seen anything like the peak of war on Russian soil yet, and Putin is going to do his best to gather up capacity to generate as much of a disaster for Ukraine and Ukrainian civilians as possible. So this is trending in the recalcitrant rather than the conciliatory direction. Enough for now, beautiful community. Catch you later.